Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you. My name is John Rood. I'm a Senior Vice President at Lockheed Martin for our international business, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session here this afternoon. One of the great things about having this distinguished panel is that pretty soon they will begin pulling out the lunch service, and looking at the menu, it looks like a delicious menu. We've seen a real growth, of course, in the United States in the popularity of Indian food. Partly why we selected these panelists is it takes a pro to operate through that and to be that close to a fine meal and not get the chance to taste any of it. But once again, they've sacrificed for their nation here, and they'll skip lunch but provide remarks for you.
I thought we were getting takeout boxes, no?
Maybe at the outside part, yeah. Wait for it. So we're really very delighted to have the co-chairs of the U.S. India Caucus in the House of Representatives with us today, Congressman Gabbard and Congressman Holding here today. And so I'll try to keep things moving along, and delighted to have the chance to be up here with you. You know, I thought one of the places we might start is that here in Washington, of course, we have a long tradition of vigorous political debate, and Teddy Roosevelt often famously referred to it as the arena. Regrettably, the arena has become a little more contentious of late, but it's interesting to me that when you talk about U.S. India relations and about how to promote them, there's been a great degree of bipartisanship in that area. And so I thought maybe a good place to start as the co-chairman of the U.S. India Caucus would be a place to say, why do you think that the U.S. India relationship stands out in that sense here in Washington? Congresswoman, maybe you could start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a lot of points that you can look at as to why there is such a bipartisan commitment in both the House and the Senate towards this U.S.-India relationship. I think first, if you look at the fabric of our communities across this country, the influence and impact of Indians and Indian Americans in this country has been building and grown considerably over the years. So it's impossible to separate our constituencies from those who are really looking towards or who have benefited from a growing U.S.-India partnership. Similarly, when you look at the economic impact of this growing economic friendship, you can see that impact again in all 50 states across the country. Just yesterday, I was glad to be there to help with the launch of the East-West Center and FICCI's report on the U.S.-India friendship. And by the numbers, state by state, what does that impact mean from an economic perspective, from an education perspective, from an immigration and travel perspective? And you can really see that broken down all across the 50 states, regardless of representation or political party, how important this relationship is and why there is so much support for it.
Well, I tell you, the answer to your question really also answers the question on why I'm involved in the U.S.-India relationship and co-chair of the caucus. Why does a congressman from North Carolina so engaged on the U.S.-India relationship? And that's because I represent over 20,000 Indian Americans who call North Carolina home. And so I met these folks on the campaign trail when I was first running, and they had never been engaged in politics before. But they were very energized by the prospects of Modi becoming prime minister. And that energy translated, and they wanted to have some influence on the U.S.-India relationship. They wanted their mother country to have a better relationship with their home country. And so they energized me and got me thinking, who is this Modi fellow? And so when I got to Congress, there were some issues around that, and became engaged on that when I sat on the Foreign Affairs Committee in my first term, and went to India, led a CODEL to India in my very first term in Congress, first year in Congress. Chairman Ed Royce was very kind to send me over there. Of course, as an aside, the day I left was also the day that Preet Bharara, my former colleague and U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, had the deputy consul arrested and went through that process. So I landed in Delhi, and our ambassador at the time, Nancy Powell, suggested that I just leave. That nothing good would come of this. But I declined her invitation to leave and stayed. And it turned out to be very formative, informative, and transformational for me as far as where my interests lie. And so it is, I think, Tulsi, you were hitting on it yourself, it is the diaspora in the United States which are bipartisan. My Indian American supporters at home, it's not a partisan conversation that we have. And I think that replicates itself all around the country. And when the members of the India Caucus get together and when we talk about India issues, it's never a partisan conversation. So.
It's very good. Well, of course, the last 4 presidential elections have alternated between the Democrats and Republicans winning the White House. And yesterday, of course, President Trump hosted Prime Minister Modi. And our president is very famous for unique handshakes at different times. Yesterday, we saw the hug heard around the world, I guess. But as you sit from your posts as leaders in the House at how that relationship is starting, how do you see your agenda forming up on the caucus, what you plan to advance to promote those ties, and how does that relate to what the President and the Prime Minister spoke to yesterday? Perhaps you could begin, Congresswoman?
Sure. You know, I think that, as you mentioned, through the changeover and the transitions of administrations, what we have seen growing through, especially the last few years, I know for us in Congress and for leaders on the caucus, we haven't skipped a beat. We haven't been sitting around waiting for signs to come from this new administration. We've been continuing our work in trying to continue to support and strengthen and move forward this U.S. India partnership and friendship. So that commitment is solid and it's there. I think the reports and the statements that came out of the White House in particular after the meeting yesterday, I think are very much aligned with what we've been working on already, which is a large focus, obviously, on economic opportunity that's mutually beneficial, also looking at continued security and mill-to-mill cooperations, and you can go down the line of energy and education and many other areas where it appears there were discussions yesterday. We saw the different secretaries who attended the dinner last night, who I think showed a good sign in saying, hey, we treat this relationship with a high level of importance, and we're here and we're engaged to be able to see how we can work together.
It's marvelous, Congressman.
So politicians come and go. Some politicians leave a more lasting mark or legacy than others do. So I view our work in the India Caucus, if we can promote better business ties between our two countries, those are the ties that will endure longer than political ties, longer than individual ties. These business relationships that promote jobs in our economy, jobs in the Indian economy, direct investment in the two economies. If we can build our trade up to our economic relationship up to $500 billion, as the Prime Minister has indicated, that will endure much longer than a bear hug or a handshake. Those are all good facilitators. And I've seen the pictures of this bear hug, and I think the Prime Minister has said he has a 52-inch chest. I mean, that is a big chest. That would be I've never been the recipient of a bear hug. A handshake, yes, but no bear hug. But truly, it is what you all are about here today in the USIBC in promoting the business-to-business relationships. These are the things that will get us through tough political times, or politicians who don't agree with us, or the Indian media causing a big fuss, or our tabloid media causing a big fuss. Those business relationships endure much longer, I believe.
Absolutely. It was fun to watch the Prime Minister's hug. I don't know that he has watched that much American football, but I think he could have had a career in his younger days. So, that's a very good point that I'd like to pick up on, which is John Chambers talked about the importance of building that trade relationship to an unprecedented level and the cooperative activities, and how do we get at reducing some of the barriers and some of the structural impediments. I know that that's a priority for the governments on both sides, but Obviously, we've all read the Constitution. The Congress plays the preeminent role in regulating that kind of intra-country, intra-state commerce. So you as leaders in the Congress for the U.S. India Caucus obviously have a big role to play. Sure. Maybe you could talk about that.
Well, John Chambers in Cisco has a very kind of unique perspective on this because they have a wonderful campus that I've toured in India, and they have a wonderful campus in North Carolina with lots of employees who are my constituents. And so there's no better person or group to talk to about the ease of doing business in the United States and the ease of doing business or the problems of doing business in the United States or India. And any way we can facilitate a greater ease of doing business. I think I've been urging now, I've been on the Ways and Means Committee now in my second term, and one of the first things that I brought up with our Trade Council and with the former Trade Ambassador, and again with the Trade Ambassador last week, is a bilateral investment treaty between our two countries. That could be the foundation for other treaties, a bilateral trade agreement. And those would certainly ease impediments to doing business. So.
Very good. Congresswoman, would you like to add?
Yeah, it's, I think sometimes the conversation is a little weighted more heavily against India as far as the difficulty in doing business there sometimes. But I think we can be honest in recognizing that there's work to do on both sides and by both parties. And there's also been progress that's been made on both sides. I know that one area that we're looking at here is just seeing how we can help to facilitate and push forward, given there are still a lot of vacancies in the State Department that unfortunately can sometimes put a cog in the works with some of the deals that we're looking to move forward. So I know that's something that we're just looking to see how we can help and fill the holes and help make sure that things keep moving along.
But I'd also raise that that's the area where we can be helpful in the India Caucus to the extent that there are agencies out there that are understaffed that we need to raise a priority. We can do that.
Right.
And we did that recently with trying to get the C-17 approved, the sale of recent C-17 out of the State Department, or with the recent approval of the sale of drone technology to India. The India Caucus and you and I as leaders of that, are more than willing to weigh in with the executive branch to try to move things forward.
Absolutely. And Congressman, one of the things that you sponsored last year was some legislation in the security arena, the U.S. India Defense Technology Partnership. And in listening to the Prime Minister and the President speak yesterday, it was gratifying to hear the foundations of a close relationship based on shared values, the support for democracy, the idea of a trade agenda, people-to-people agendas. But the other thing, and you alluded to this as well, Congresswoman Gabbard, is the security relationship. When you see the threats facing you in similar ways and you're prepared to cooperate as countries, this is just so essential. And so your legislation to designate India as a major defense partner that was eventually enacted as part of the National Defense Authorization Act is quite an accomplishment. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see the vision of that legislation, and so far, what do you think the next steps are?
Sure. Well, I'll have to give credit to a visit to Hawaii for the idea. I was at Pacific Command a number of years ago, and in the briefing, the Admiral giving the briefing, was talking about the increase of capabilities of China and what China is doing throughout the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and it was kind of alarming. And I said, give me a bright spot. And he said India, and talked about the relationship that our military has with the Indian military, particularly with the Navy and joint exercises that we do. And having that in the back of my mind, when we broached the idea of putting language into the NDAA to elevate India's status as a defense partner, I said, this really makes a lot of sense. And, we put together a little coalition, the U.S. IBC being very important in that, and talked to a lot of members on the floor. Mac Thornberry ended up being very helpful in this. On the Senate side, we got some help, but I think that our military folks, and you deal with it from the Armed Services Committee angle, really view India as a critical partner in a lot of threats that we face around the world, both conventional threats and unconventional threats.
Yeah. I think one of the next steps that we're looking forward from this administration is to actually appoint someone from the executive branch to be that point person to ensure that this defense cooperation continues as Congressman Holding's language that was passed intended. So we're very hopeful that that will happen sooner rather than later, so that we can continue to build on that progress.
Absolutely, and one of the things as India's influence around the world grows, we in the United States have enjoyed a strong relationship so far, but if you think about the potential to really go further, unfortunately we've both been the victims of brutal terrorist attacks. Yeah. We see some of the same dangers from the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction around the world, the concerns about what China is doing in the global commons and in the Far East. So in addition to the trade that provides capabilities that enable this greater presence by a country like India on the world stage, are things that we need to do from the U.S. government's perspective to encourage that greater partnership in dealing with common challenges out in the Pacific or elsewhere?
Well, I think a lot of these things are already happening. You referenced Admiral Harris, the commander of Pacific Command, has placed India as one of his highest priorities, increasing the numbers of military exercises with India to a point where it's happening more with India than any other country in the region. There is the Malabar naval exercise coming up very soon that will be the largest in history yet for the United States and India. And we're going to continue to see more of this. The more there are interoperability challenges are overcome, and the more that there are technological advances that allow our military to work very closely and seamlessly with the Indian military. I think the recognition is already there, whether you're talking about counterterrorism, whether you're talking about cyber threats or other things. We are aligned in our goals and our objectives. So it's just a matter of making sure that the pieces are in place for us to be able to best maximize that partnership that already exists.
I'd also pick up on, we can synthesize Make in India and America First. I was in India earlier this year. It was a big topic, but there's another bright spot on the horizon having to do with Lockheed Martin and the assembly, the manufacture of the F-16. There is an opportunity for the entire manufacture of the F-16 to move to India. I think that would be a great synthesis not only of Make in India and America First, because it's of great benefit to the United States to keep the F-16 in production. So it synthesizes those two, but it also synthesizes our defense relationship and our partnership. What could be better? What could be more symbolic of our relationship, our strategic partnership, than for the F-16 to be manufactured in India under a joint venture?
Well, Congressman, I certainly
Not
concur with that statement.
Anything, but
Just add, it's the world's most successful fighter aircraft with more than 4,600 produced. But this is about you and not me.
You just perked up, John. You just got interested.
Yes.
Freedom isn't free, and the F-16 has a lot to do with freedom. So there you go.
Amen, brother. Well, thank you for that. I do think that the defense relationship between the countries has come a long way, and the Malabar exercises and other things are really important. And I always like looking at the proverbs from other countries because they sometimes tell you a lot about them. And there is an Indian proverb which says, life is like a lamp flame. It needs a little oil now and then to keep going. So as we look at the success that we've had, what are some of those things that we need to do to put in the reservoir of oil here for the security relationship that might take it to the next level? Is it funding for things like Project Malabar? Is it the creation of this position? How can we concretely add a little oil here to the flame to make sure that burns brightly?
I think, simply put, it is not looking at just one sector or one area as being the solution or being the one thing that's going to move this thing forward. There are so many different opportunities that it's very exciting to look at what the opportunities are. I think it's just going to be important to keep the attention focused on this. There are a lot of issues and challenges in the world. So we want to make sure that in the private sector as well as in the government side that we continue to focus on the U.S. India partnership as a high priority and also make sure that we are providing that fuel with facts and information. I think unfortunately sometimes things can be derailed when detractors for one reason or another put things out that may not be true or that may not be backed up by the facts. And I know that this is something that is going to continue to be debated heavily through the immigration conversation, but really again looking at the facts of what are the mutually beneficial impacts for the United States and India for our partnership. And when you actually dig down and look at the numbers speak for themselves about why this relationship is so important.
So I think the military to military relationship, I think something that could add a little oil to that flame is a better intelligence sharing cooperation between our two countries. We've mentioned the threat of terrorism. We both face terrorist threats, which are similar, and I think more sharing in that regard will add some oil to that. These joint ventures and foreign direct investment in our two countries, I think will continue to add oil to the lamp. And I think there's also some great opportunities in healthcare between our two countries. I have some good friends who founded a hospital in Mumbai, and they partner with Mass General, and they've done this for a long, long time. But I think more partnerships in the healthcare space. We have 70,000 Indian American doctors in the United States. And a lot of them want to find some way to give back to their mother country and practice medicine there. And with technology doing what it's doing, it can be done remotely. There's some very fascinating developments in robotics and medicine and how you're able to remotely control these. And I think more partnerships there would be something that would be fruitful. And again, it loops in the diaspora who are, as I mentioned at the start of this conversation, are very engaged and want to see our two countries have a better relationship and a long-term prospering relationship.
I think that's fantastic. And listening to John Chambers talk earlier about the digital revolution and how innovation is really transforming our worlds and the leadership role that both India and the United States are playing there. Now, living in the United States, we often think about how we might share some of our advances with others. But in India, there's been this tremendous progress also where there might be some things that we could import. I'm very impressed myself, I don't know about you, with the Prime Minister's digitization, demonetization initiative. And as a personal fan of that, having bought several things today but not taken any money out of my wallet but pressed buttons on my phone, I really like this trend. Maybe you could talk about the innovation agenda in general and how do we foster that tie between India and the United States?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of inspiration to be found in some of the things that he's begun to succeed with in India, particularly with empowering people who are living in poverty and women in particular in the very, very rural communities and the different tribal communities in India simply through the use of technology and things that were unimaginable before where they could not be connected with others. It's an exciting thing for the empowerment of people in India, but I think there are lessons here as well. I live in a state that's separated by water, a number of different islands, and in our rural communities, the access to medicine is very difficult because it's tough to retain physicians and it's very hard to attract those who have different specialties in particular. So even on our smallest islands, introducing and finding better ways to deliver telemedicine, as an example, which I spoke to someone who does that very well in India yesterday, there are lessons that we can learn and benefit from that in some of our most rural communities in places like Hawaii and Alaska and in other parts of the country. It's exciting.
Well, my trip to India at the beginning of the year focused a lot on Digital India. And although the Prime Minister did not say it or put it in these terms, my takeaway at the end of the trip is if you're ever going to get a handle on the bureaucracy in India, Digital India is the way to do it. Because it takes the bureaucrat, the arbitrariness of bureaucratic misbehavior out of the process. And it is the same problem that we face here in the United States with trying to remodel and reform government and find efficiencies. We had a hearing last year on the earned income tax credit. I'm not going to bore you with much tax law, but do you know what the erroneous payment rate is on the earned income tax credit from the IRS? They're in charge of doing this. 26%. Do you know what the erroneous payment rate is? The Visa Card Corporation, which does, I think, $3 trillion worth of transactions a year. It's like 0.01% or 0.03%. There's a breakdown here somewhere. And so I think what Modi is embracing with Digital India is something that we can learn from here and embrace it and get smart companies like Cisco and a software company in my district called SAS can solve a lot of these problems.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we could keep going for quite some time, and it looks like we've progressed almost all the way through the meal
It smells
service.
really good, by the way.
You really can't smell it up here. I'm not kidding.
Oh my gosh.
Dal Makhani is in my thoughts already, but I really want to thank terrific panelists for coming. First of all, for being leaders in this issue in the United States Congress, but also being willing to share that with this audience. And thank you for the time you spent today.
Thank you
Please
for the
join me
opportunity.
for congratulating them.